Today's webinar is the first in our series titled A Loon's Eye View, Exploring Citizen Science with Ornithologist Mark Peck. It'll feature a 20-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute Q&A. We welcome you to enter your questions into the chat during the presentation. We'll be monitoring the chat and we'll read your questions out during the question and answer period. With that, we'd like to now introduce Mark Peck. Mark is the collections specialist in ornithology at the Royal Ontario Museum and the director of the Environmental Visual Communications program with the Royal Ontario Museum and Fleming College, and the program counselor for the Toronto Ornithological Club. He is responsible for managing the bird collections and developing programs to engage the public in research, biodiversity, and several citizen science-related initiatives. He's also a very enthusiastic volunteer for the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, which you'll find out in the presentation. With that, I will hand it over to Mark to share his presentation.
Great. Thanks, Camille. Thanks, Katie, for all your help here. Let me just get this set up for everyone. All right. So I'm really excited to be here. It's that time of year again when the loons have arrived back. And I'm coming to you not as an ornithologist from the Royal Ontario Museum, but as an obsessed citizen scientist. And I'll go into more detail about that, but I think I'll start at the beginning. And the beginning really, in the case of the common loons, started 7 years ago when my wife and I decided that we were going to get a cottage, or I guess in BC, that would be a cabin. And my wife had two prerequisites. She said she wanted a nice secluded lake, and we had to be on a lake. And for me, it was even more simple than that. What I wanted was to be part of this environment. I have been enamored and in love with loons ever since I can remember, and I think it stems back from that call. And so for me, the cottage was about being on a lake where I could actually understand loons and maybe help loons in some way. And that was the exciting part for me. And when we bought the cottage in, strangely enough, sort of in March, and we had no idea. The lake was still covered with snow and ice. I really had no idea, other than the previous owner said, "Oh yeah, we have loons on the lake, don't worry." And sure enough, the lake opened up and I started to learn a little bit more about loons all the time. And I want to go through that quickly as we go and then talk about the citizen science and the value that citizen science has at the end. So that call you just heard is the whale. And the whale for a loon is a communication tool between either the pair of loons on the lake or loons on nearby lake. It's not very territorial or aggressive, other than it's sort of just a communication tool. But there's others. That's known as the tremolo, and I think most of these should be familiar to everyone. That is much more of an aggressive sound, and you'll often hear loons doing that while they're flying over a lake, communicating with other loons on that lake or nearby lakes that, you know, they're sort of checking things out and seeing what's happening. And you'll often, if you're observing your loons on your lake, when they hear that sound, you'll often see them just sort of sink slowly down into the water, almost becoming like a stone, or very subtle in the water and almost cryptic in their coloring. All right. In order to understand this sound, you have to be out with the loons a little more in order to hear this. This is what we call a hoot call. And really, it's the communication between the young and the adults, and usually when they're in close proximity to each other. And it's really just a tool to sort of talk back and forth a little bit and keep in mind where everybody is. And then there's this one. And as you can guess, or as you can see, that's the yodel. And the yodel is only done by the male loon. And it happens very early. It happens as the loons arrive back on their lakes. Males are setting up territories, establishing territories. And as soon as they're back in, and that's usually just as ice is coming out of the lake. So in this case, this is a loon from our lake. There's still ice in the background. And that male is back in, and he's very serious and intent about establishing his territory and excluding other loons from the area. So that yodel, when you hear that, that's really sort of the, I mean business, stay out of this area for you. All right. So when we talk about loons, or when we think about loons, what we normally think about is a pair on a lake. And especially a smaller lake, that's about all a lake can take. So bigger lakes might get 2 pairs, but smaller lakes are usually just going to have 1 pair. But it's not the only time that you're going to see loons in 2s. So at the beginning of the breeding season, when loons are sort of checking things out and establishing dominance or territories in the lake, you may have loons dropping in to sort of check each other out to see if maybe they can take over that territory, or just, they're passing by and they're dropping in and realizing, okay, we've got to move on. The other time you often see loons in bigger groups is in the fall, where you may see up to 15 or 20 loons on a lake, all swimming fairly happily together as far as you can tell. And that's because the breeding season is over, that territoriality has sort of dropped off, and loons are sort of hanging out with each other at that point, and they're not really worried about the territory. So most of the time you will see loons as solitary birds, but occasionally early spring and in the fall or late summer, you'll start to see them sort of flock up together. Okay. Now, when loons first arrive, especially in Canada, they have to deal with a few problems. And the biggest problem, like many cabin or cottage owners, is bugs and biting insects. So I don't know about BC so much, but in Ontario, people often delay opening up their cottages until the black flies or the mosquitoes have sort of dropped off a bit. Same problem exists for loons. Loons have to, as you can imagine, have to deal with these mosquitoes with really no escape. They can't go into the house. They don't have repellent. So they're out there. And what will often happen is loons will actually delay their breeding for up to a month while they're waiting for the biggest populations or the biggest densities of mosquitoes and black flies to sort of drop back and fall back. And there's one species known as Simulium annulus, or the loon black fly, that actually focuses on feeding on loons. And it's a remarkable black fly in this sense. And I'm just going to play a short little video that I made. And keep an eye on the loon, but also keep an eye on the black flies on the back of the head of this bird. Let me just play this for you. So you can see the black flies there, no problem. Loon's on the water, going to dive under. That should get rid of the black flies. You come back up, black flies are still on the back of the neck. And so, and the bird is bothered, as you'll start to see. It's trying to get rid of the black flies. Doesn't matter. The black flies have figured out how to hold on even underwater. And then they're trying to sort of get under the feathers and get to some skin and take blood. And it's a very serious challenge for loons to be able to deal with this. So if you're ever wondering why loons come back at the beginning of May or even late April, and they don't start nesting until June, this is one of the main reasons. They're actually waiting for black fly populations to die down before they can attempt to be on their nest. Okay, eventually everything works out, and then loons will build a nest. They prefer using islands if possible. So if you do have an island on your lake, or a small island on your lake, or sort of rocky outcrops, give them a little extra space in the spring to provide room for loons to nest. We've put up signs in our lake saying, loons breed in this area, and that seems to have helped people give loons a little more distance. Also, keep in mind, it may not be on an island. If your lake doesn't have an island, but you have a pair of loons, they're going to be looking for a secluded area, hopefully with not a lot of wave action, and they may build up the nest right from the shore itself, or even nest on the shore. But given cottage and cabin problems, especially with predators like raccoons and minks these days, it's probably safer if they can get out to an island where they're a little more protected from the predators. Loons always lay 2 eggs, and those eggs will be incubated for about 28 to 30 days. And you wonder why loons are always nesting along the shoreline, and I can give you a simple answer by just showing you this video. It's not pretty. Loons do not walk well, and so this can be a little hard to watch for you, but do your best. I'm only kidding, really, but oops, let me back up. Try that again. Okay, watch how gracefully a loon gets up onto her nest or his nest. Like that really is a little hard to watch. You have to have a little sympathy for the loons. So that's why it's so important for loons to have these good shoreline areas where they can feel safe and a little bit protected from waves, from wind action, from boat action even, and be able to get up onto their nest easily. And so water level also plays an important part. So if your lake does fluctuate, if there's a way to keep it steady for that sort of month that the loons are on the nest, it would be really helpful. All right. As I mentioned before, loons will incubate their eggs for about 28 to 30 days. The good news is males and females both incubate, so they do get a bit of a break. And when they're on their nest, they're usually just sitting quietly, trying to avoid the mosquitoes and the black flies, and keeping an eye on things. So they're not spending a lot of time sleeping there. And if a loon has its head up like it is in this photograph, it's fairly comfortable. Based on the behavior, you can say, okay, the loon's keeping an eye on me, but is not too threatened. If you ever see a loon drop down so that the head becomes even with the body and sort of pointing out toward the water, that's when a loon is a little more agitated and more nervous. And if you are in a canoe or a boat, you should probably back off at that point. And I should mention that all of these photographs were taken by me in a kayak. And what I have discovered is it's much easier to photograph loons on lakes that are comfortable with people. And if you do it carefully and gradually, the loons get very comfortable with you and don't seem to have a problem. And at least I hope that's the case. All right, 30 days goes by, and then the young loons hatch out of the egg. Takes about a day or two. They both tend to hatch out about the same time, which is really helpful for the parents, and almost immediately leave that nest. And once they leave the nest, they're not going back. So for the first week or two, baby loons will often be seen on the parent's back or even hidden underneath the wings themselves, or floating beside the parents for 5 or 10 minutes, and then they'll crawl back underneath the wing and get back on the back. And it's a really great time to watch loons. One of the birds is usually responsible for taking care of the young, while the other male or partner is actually feeding, looking for food and then providing it to the young as well. And I'm just going to go through. Oh, and I did want to mention that loons are actually incredibly good parents. This is a photograph. I was trying to get a photograph of the baby, and immediately the parent got in between me and photobombed me, so I never really did get a half decent photograph of the young bird. But it was really fun to see how, no matter how I sort of tried to maneuver around, the parent stayed in between the two of us the entire time. All right. As most of you know, loons feed mainly on fish and fish of varying sizes. They prefer sunfish and pumpkin seed because they're a little easier to catch rather than trout and salmon. So loons aren't, although they will feed occasionally on trout or salmon. So loons aren't going to be a big challenge if you're thinking, if you're a fisher and saying, you know what, these birds are driving me crazy. I think we have to make space for loons on our lakes as fishers as well as humans. Okay, but in addition to the fish, especially when loons have young varying sizes, there's actually a variety of food that's being fed to them. So I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but that's a dragonfly larva that the young is being fed. And if we move on a little further, there's a crayfish that the parents are bringing into the young. And interestingly enough, if you have leeches in your lake, loons actually also feed on leeches. So you want to promote loons on your lake, especially if you have a leech problem. All right. It takes about 12 weeks for a young to grow. And I'm just going to go through a sort of a slow time lapse so you get an idea what it looks like. Each week or two, the loon gets a little bit longer, changes color a little bit, goes into a browner. Then it starts to get actually from down, moving into sort of proper feathers. And at this point, they're still being fed by their parents. But by now, they're starting to do a little bit of feeding on their own. It's about week 8. This is about week 10. So loons are actually starting to look like adults. The eye's brown, though. The eye is not red. And finally, you'll get a full juvenile and full plumage. And at about 10 weeks, what you'll often notice is one of the parents will actually leave and start to migrate south. One of the other parent, usually the male, will stay for another week or two with the juvenile bird. And at that point, it will also leave. Now, the juvenile may stay for a couple more weeks, may stay for a month, depending on how the food resources are and how the weather is. But you can actually find loons, young loons on lakes for up to a month without any parents in sight. And they are recognizable. If you just look at the back of the bird, you'll see it's much more scalloped than the spotting of the adult loons. However, adult loons, if you ever see them in August or September, they've also started molting into a winter plumage. And in our case, they're going to be heading, in your case, in BC, they're going to be heading off to winter off the west coast of southern BC and Oregon and further down. In the east side of here in Toronto or north of Toronto, ours end up off the coast of New Jersey and some of those areas, whereas others will end up in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida, which is exactly where I would go if I was going to have to winter on the Gulf Coast anywhere. I think I'd head to the Gulf of Mexico. Anyway, as you can see, the adults also move into much more of a winter plumage, but still very identifiable as an adult compared to a young one. So whenever you're looking at it, you can identify whether you're looking at adults or immatures or juveniles without too much difficulty. You also notice it's interesting is the eye color starts to fade from that bright red that they have in the breeding season. Okay, that's a little bit more about loons. What I really want to talk about today as well is citizen science. And Living Lakes is doing some wonderful work both on, on lake program. And I really wanted to combine this storyline with citizen science from a bird perspective. So if you are doing work with Living Lakes, you might get involved with the Lake Blitz, which is a great opportunity to get out and do some citizen science or community science, or the new term now, believe it or not, is participatory science. I'm still good with citizen science. You can change it if you want. But anyway, think about Lake Blitz and also think about the photo challenge that Living Lakes is running as well. But the one I'm talking about today is something called the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey. And that's a survey that's run by Birds Canada which is probably the bird organization, national bird organization in Canada. And it's across the board from BC all the way to Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland. And they do a really wonderful job in their citizen science program. They have, I think, 17 or 20 different programs, anywhere from Project Feeder Watch in the wintertime, Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, they promote eBird. So if you want to learn more about citizen science opportunities from a bird perspective, head to Birds Canada and check out their site. All right, so I really love what the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey has been doing. It's run for about 43 years now. It's been surveying across Canada. As you can see, greater population in Southern Ontario means there's been a lot more lake surveys done down here, or loon surveys done in Southern Ontario, but it is across the board. And the orange area, shaded area there, is loon distribution, or the common loon distribution across Canada. And as you can see, it covers off all of the territories as well as all of the provinces. And so it's a bird that we have tremendous responsibility for, because almost the entire breeding population of common loons are found within Canada, with a little bit over in Europe and a little bit in the States. But the vast majority of this bird is found in Canada. Okay, so as I mentioned before, Canadian Lakes Loon Survey has been doing their work for 43 years, or volunteers have been doing their work with them for 43 years. And they've come up through this citizen science work and effort with some really wonderful information about loons. And it's information that would not be available to scientists or researchers without the tremendous help of amateur birders, cottage owners or cabin owners, people who care about the environment. And it's a remarkable feedback, and so much fun to do. So it only takes about 3 days out of your summer, not even days, 3 separate visits to a loon or the lake where the loons are, one in May, one in June, and one in July. And then you just send in the information. It's all free. You can register for free. But the value is we get to learn about loons, and we get to learn about the health of our lakes and what impacts humans are having on those lakes. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about loons today is, as you can see from this figure, loon populations or productivity is going down. And it's been going down since 1992. And that little blue hashed line at the bottom there, if the red line goes below that, that means populations are actually declining. So we're getting very close to an area and to a time, unless we start to improve, or loons start to improve productivity, that we're going to see population declines in Canada. In addition to that, all this information that's gathered is able to actually tell us about what works for loons and what's not working. And the decline, as I mentioned before, is actually steeper on the East Coast. It seems like there is a decline in BC and Alberta, but it's not as serious as it is as you move eastward across the country. In addition, they've also discovered through this work that April temperatures play a huge role in productivity for loons. So when we have warmer Aprils where the lakes come off earlier, loons are able to get in earlier, the mosquitoes and black flies will die down a little earlier, they have much greater success over the summer. So what impact climate change is going to have on that is going to be really interesting to find out about. We move on to the next one. And this isn't as much of a problem as it used to be, but many of you will remember acid lakes and the problems we had in the 80s and 90s on acid lakes. It's still having an impact on loons. So the higher lake or higher acidity in lakes, the less productive loons are. So healthy lakes are not high acid lakes. And so in other words, productivity for young loons is much greater in a low acid lake. And that's probably true for biodiversity like the fish in the lake and the invertebrates in the lake as well. Okay. The other important factor that seems to be affecting loons is mercury content. And mercury content is partly by acid rain, but it's also by potentially oil or carbon offset, carbon material and through boats and other things. So the less mercury you have in the lake, the more successful loons are going to be. And what they've been doing is actually using yellow perch to actually measure the mercury content, and it's provided a lot of wonderful information. I'm going to show you another picture here, and this one might surprise you. So we often think of bald eagles and cormorants as probably bad for most waterfowl because they're either competitors in the case of cormorants, or they could be actual predators, is the case of bald eagle. And truth is, in the case of common loons, lakes that have both loons and bald eagles and or cormorants tend to be more successful. So the bald eagle is not a big predator of common loons. They would prefer fish if they could get it. And the cormorant probably is not a big competitor against loons. So what it probably means, if you've got loons on your lake with bald eagles and cormorants, you have a good, healthy lake with lots of fish. So you don't have to worry about the bald eagles eating the young loons, although it does happen, or the cormorants out competing them for fish. All right. So I wanted to talk about what I've done. And so, as I mentioned before, I did get a little obsessed with my loon citizen science. And so I did monitor nests every year. I started out fairly simple. I went to our lake and 2 other lakes nearby and just monitored and to see how things were successful. And during COVID, I had an opportunity to spend a little more time, so I went to a few more lakes. The sad part is I'm not seeing a lot of productivity in the lakes in and around our cottage or cabin. As you can see, I monitored 3, 8, 9, 10, 6 nests. And usually out of those, on average, sort of 6 nests, we might get 1 or 2 young off every year. And last year in 2023, I had 6 nests. Only one of the nests actually hatched out young, and those 2 young, fortunately, were successful, but they actually were produced on an artificial platform. So actually, Lake Association cared enough to say, you know what, we don't have good nesting habitat. So they built actually a loon platform, which turned out to be successful, which was really wonderful. Okay, really quickly, I know how am I doing on time? We good, Camille?
We're just about at time. So
okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, really quickly.
But this is great.
2 other things that are impacting loons is botulism. I'm not sure how much of an issue botulism is in lakes out west. It's become a much bigger problem in especially lakes or feeder lakes into sort of cottage country. We're having die-offs in the fall due to botulism and potentially due to relationships with zebra mussels. So if you can keep invasive species out of your lakes, so much the better. The other thing I want to touch on briefly is a very sad story. 3 years ago, I got a call from one of the other lakes near our cottage saying, I found a dead loon. Would you be willing to come and pick it up? And being a museum person, I said, yeah, I'll do that. And so I brought the loon back to the museum and I did a necropsy on it. And all I could find, the only problem I could find in the loon was that small lead sinker in the stomach of the loon. And so I sent it off to Canadian Health Wildlife Cooperative, and they were able to determine that because of that little tiny lead sinker, which is much smaller than a penny, as you can see, that's what killed that loon. So if I can ask any of you fishers out there, if you are fishing, if you can change over to different non-lead tackle or sinkers in your fishing lines or in your fishing box, that would be incredibly helpful. There's an estimate from New Hampshire that 40%, 42% of the loon deaths are actually coming from lead sinker or lead tackle. So lead is a big problem. It's not healthy for us either, but it's especially damaging to loons. All right. I hope you all get a chance to hear that sound. It's one of the most remarkable sounds in nature and one of the iconic sounds in Canada. And I thought I'd finish off by, in case you're wondering how I was invited to this whole process in the first place, and how, even though Living Lakes is out in Nelson, BC, how a person from Toronto got involved. I got involved because I love loons, I love citizen science, and my daughter, well, both my daughters, especially the one on the back of the loon here, is Georgia Peck. She works for Living Lakes. She's the Lakes program manager. And she bought me a loon. And it's up at the cottage every year. So thank you all very much for listening. Thanks, Diana Peck, for dropping in. And I'll be happy to answer any questions now. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Oh, that's fantastic, Mark. Thank you so much for all of that, sharing all of your knowledge, and especially that photo at the end. That made my night. I'll also say that this year, for those who are taking part in the monitoring, we will be giving away one of those loon floaties from Float A for whoever collects the most data. So that could be you. So yeah, we'd like to open it to questions. So for those who can stick around, we had a couple questions in the chat that came in, really great questions. So I'll pass it over to Katie to ask those. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah.
Awesome. So our first question is from Janice, and she was wondering, she recently saw a juvenile loon on a lake with a breeding pair and was wondering if this is common. It was last week.
Now that seems a little unusual at this point. Now, I'm not sure when breeding season for loons start in BC. I'm sure it's a week or two earlier, but that's too early to have young loons out on the lake. So if it's a big enough lake, it may be that it's a first year bird that's come back. But I imagine it won't stay very long because, you know, the breeding pair on the lake probably does not appreciate having an extra loon around. So it'll probably get pushed off pretty quickly.
Thank you. Ed asked, he has seen gatherings of 20 plus loons quite a few times, as you mentioned. And he was just wondering if they are preparing for something. Do they migrate? Is there a reason that they gather?
Yeah, at the end of the, you know, the sort of the breeding season, they do gather, and some of them can be quite large groups. And there's some suggestion that actually the gathering together helps actually forage for food. So they're able to forage for food a little more effectively in groups, maybe protect themselves from predators a little bit, but they don't seem to mind being together during that time period. And then eventually they will migrate, and they tend to be more solitary in the wintertime. But during that sort of migration period, they're often found in reasonably good sized groups together.
Thank you. We had another question here. Are geese a threat to loons on small lakes where only one pair of loons can nest? It looks like someone has been harming the nests for the geese, and they're wondering if this is harmful or, yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I think Canada geese and loons would be, yeah, that would be a bit of a fight. Loons don't usually like other waterfowl on their lake. And, you know, so if you see a pair of loons on a small lake, you often don't see mergansers or wood duck on that lake. They tend to be fairly aggressive, as are Canada geese. I don't think Canada geese would probably stick around um, on a lake with a pair of loons, unless they got there first and were already nesting. But I don't think they'd probably stay on the lake near the loons if they could possibly help it. But I really don't know. That's an excellent question.
Awesome. There's just a few more popping up in the chat here. Sorry. Is it true that loons mate for life?
No, it's not true. So what happens is a loon pair will stay on a lake as long as they can, but there are going to be years when either a new male or a new female will try to come into that lake and take over that territory. And if they do, and they can be pretty violent fights. And loons have this, you know, what we think of as kind of a strange habit where they'll dive under and they'll try to spear each other in the breast with their bill to sort of, you know, physically damage the other loon. And it's a pretty aggressive, they can be very aggressive. But yeah, they will switch over and, you know, you have to defend your territory. And if you don't, another loon's going to take over and potentially take your mate with you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Someone asked, and I don't know if you'll be able to speak to this, but do we lose oxygen in lakes because of the mercury?
I think it does change the oxygen levels. And I think that's one of the fears with climate change is that we will, you know, with rising and falling lake levels, it impacts the chemical makeup of those lakes and increases mercury. I'm not sure how that actually happens. You know, maybe Living Lakes could probably tell me that better than I could tell you.
Yeah, we can get back to that person with an answer, send them an email. So maybe time for 2 more questions. Can you speak to the more to the botulism impacts from zebra mussels?
So yeah, what happens in that case is zebra mussels create this sort of perfect situation where they die on the or on the lake bed, and there are other fish that bring them up, and so the zebra mussels start the botulism. It's brought up into the fish, which then carry it with them, and then it's concentrated in the loons when they're feeding on the fish. And we've seen more and more die-offs in some of our bigger lakes north of Toronto, not necessarily in the lakes where the loons are breeding, but you know, with the way we move boats around and the way we bring stuff in and out, there's always a danger of bringing more zebra mussels into lakes that don't have it or other invasive species. So, you know, I think whenever you can, make sure you wash the hull of your boats carefully to try and minimize bringing in invasive species or, you know, especially zebra mussels into your own lakes.
And then we'll do one last one here. Where can someone find info for Alberta and BC on which lakes that loons nest in?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So go to Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, and there's a lot of information on the page. It'll tell you there's a booklet available. You can also contact Kathy Jones, and the email will be on the web page itself. And she's the coordinator of the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, and she'll provide all the information you want. It's really a wonderful resource, and it's fun to do. You know, there's nothing better than getting out in a canoe or a kayak at 6 o'clock in the morning. You can be fishing, You could just have your coffee. You could just be out listening to the birds. It's just a great way to spend the morning, and you can contribute to important conservation initiatives and healthy lakes by doing so. So yeah, get involved, get in touch with Canadian Lakes Loon Survey, and Kathy Jones is the coordinator who'll be able to answer all your questions.